The late afternoon sun stretched golden fingers across the neighborhood park, draping the playground in a warm, inviting glow. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and the faint sweetness of blooming flowers, signaling the arrival of spring. Children's laughter rang through the space, a lively symphony of youthful energy. On the far side of the park, a boy with a mop of curly brown hair and an eager expression dribbled a slightly scuffed soccer ball between his feet. His name was Oliver, but most people just called him Ollie. He was 11, full of boundless energy, and always looking for a new challenge. Today's mission, perfecting his trick shots without accidentally sending the ball flying into someone else's game. A few feet away, his mother, Grace, settled onto a sun-warmed wooden bench. She tucked a loose strand of wavy chestnut hair behind her ear and glanced down at her phone, scrolling through the upcoming shifts at the cafe where she worked. She had memorized the schedule a dozen times over, but double-checking gave her a sense of control. "Mom, watch this," Ollie called, his voice bright with excitement. Grace looked up immediately, pocketing her phone. "I'm watching, sweetheart." With determined focus, Ollie positioned himself, calculated his angle, and launched the ball into the air. He intended to catch it on his knee, bounce it smoothly between his legs, then flick it effortlessly back into motion. But the ball had other plans. It veered off course, rolling steadily across the park's paved walkway, and coming to a stop at the feet of a man sitting alone on a bench. Ollie hesitated. The man was hunched forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, his face partially obscured by a shaggy beard and an overgrown mess of hair. His clothes, worn and slightly rumpled, suggested he'd seen better days. But it was his eyes, piercing, deep-set eyes that caught the sunlight just enough to reveal a familiar hue, that made Ollie's stomach tighten. The man reached down, fingers curling around the ball. His hands were large, weathered, as though they had spent years gripping tools or braving harsh elements. Slowly he lifted his head, locking eyes with Ollie. For a brief, electrified moment, time seemed to stand still. The man's gaze held something unreadable: recognition, regret, fear. Ollie's breath hitched. A shiver raced down his spine. There was something oddly familiar about the man, something tugging at the edges of his memory. The stranger quickly broke the moment, his movements sudden and stiff as he tossed the ball back. Then, as if realizing he had lingered too long, he rose to his feet and walked away. "Wait," Ollie called, his feet already moving. But the man was fast. He disappeared behind the brick structure that housed the public restrooms, vanishing before Ollie could close the distance. "Oliver, where are you going?" Grace's voice pulled him back. He turned to see her standing now, concern etched on her face. Ollie jogged toward her, his heart pounding. Mom, I think..." He sucked in a breath, gripping the soccer ball tight. "I think I just saw Dad." The color drained from Grace's face. She stiffened, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. "Ollie," her voice was careful, measured. "Don't say things like that." "But I'm serious," he insisted. "It was him. He had Dad's eyes the same way you always say they look when the light hits them just right." "Ollie, stop." The sharpness in her voice startled him. "That's not possible." "But, no." Her tone was final. Her chest rose and fell as she steadied herself, pressing a hand to her forehead. Ollie's shoulders slumped. "You don't believe me." "It's not about believing you, sweetheart." Grace crouched down, gently placing her hands on his shoulders. "It's about facts. Your father..." Her voice wavered. "Your father has been gone for 6 years. You know that." Ollie swallowed hard, frustration bubbling in his chest. "I know what I saw." Grace exhaled, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Come on, let's go home." That night, after Ollie had showered and retreated to his room, Grace stood at the kitchen sink, gripping the edge of the counter. The soft drip of the faucet filled the quiet space as she stared down at an old, worn photograph. In the picture, a younger version of herself beamed at the camera, tucked safely into the arms of a man with tousled dark hair and a mischievous grin. His name had once been spoken daily in their home. Now it existed only in whispers and memories. Luke. 6 years ago, he had vanished without a trace. His car had been found near a ravine, his wallet inside, the driver's door flung open as if he had stepped out for just a moment. The authorities had searched for weeks, eventually concluding that he must have fallen into the rushing water below. No body had ever been recovered, but with no evidence of life, they had declared him dead. Grace had spent years trying to believe it, trying to accept that the man she loved was never coming back, so why did her hands shake as she stared at his face in the photograph? Her phone buzzed on the counter. She snatched it up, grateful for the distraction. "Hey, it's me." The familiar voice of her best friend Laura came through the line. "Hey," Grace exhaled. "You sound off. What's wrong?" Grace hesitated before answering. "Ollie thinks he saw Luke today." There was a pause. Then Laura sighed. "Oh, honey. He was so sure." Grace squeezed her eyes shut. "And the worst part? For a second, I wanted to believe him." "Kids have vivid imaginations," Laura said gently. "He probably saw someone with a similar build. You remember how Sarah was convinced she saw her grandma at the grocery store 2 years after she passed?" Grace nodded absently, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Laura continued, her voice soothing. "It's normal, Grace. He misses his dad. But you know as well as I do. If Luke were alive, he would have come home." Grace swallowed against the lump in her throat. "Yeah, you're right." After they hung up, she lingered in the kitchen, the unease in her chest refusing to fade. By the time she finally climbed into bed, her mind was still spinning. Sleep came in restless waves, dreams muddled with memories. The sound of Luke's laughter, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the warmth of his hand in hers. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the nagging question, what if? The next morning, Grace moved through the kitchen on autopilot, pouring herself a cup of coffee while Ollie sat at the table, absent-mindedly pushing his cereal around with his spoon. The morning sunlight poured through the window, casting long golden streaks across the countertop, but the usual warmth it brought felt muted today. Something about the air felt heavier, charged with the unspoken conversation from the night before. "Mom?" Ollie finally broke the silence, his voice hesitant. Grace tensed slightly but kept her eyes on the coffee swirling in her mug. "Yeah, sweetheart?" "I know what I saw." His voice was quieter now, but steady, determined. Grace closed her eyes for a moment before turning to face him, leaning against the counter. "Ollie," she started, but stopped herself. There was no easy way to make him let this go. Sometimes when we miss someone, we see them in places they aren't really there. But what if he was? Ollie pushed his bowl aside, sitting up straighter. "What if Dad didn't—" He swallowed. "What if he didn't die?" Grace set her mug down with a soft clink against the counter. "Honey, we went through this. You remember what the police told us, what the reports said?" "But there was never a body," Ollie pointed out quickly. "That's what you always told me, that they never found him." Grace's breath caught. He had listened more closely than she realized. For years, she had told herself that Luke was gone, but in her darkest, most desperate moments, that same thought had haunted her. No body, no real proof, just a car abandoned near a riverbank and 1,000 unanswered questions. She rubbed her temple. "Ollie, I know how much you want this to be true, but wanting something doesn't make it real." His face fell, disappointment settling into his features. He pushed back his chair, grabbing his backpack from the floor. "I gotta go," he mumbled, heading for the front door. Grace sighed, following him. "Sweetheart, wait." But he was already out the door, hurrying down the steps toward his bike. She hesitated, watching as he pedaled down the street, his small frame rigid with frustration. A pang of guilt settled in her chest. She hated shutting him down like this, but what else could she do? As the day wore on, the unease gnawed at her. Between managing the cafe, filling out orders, and chatting with customers, her mind kept drifting back to the park, to the man on the bench, to the look in Ollie's eyes when he had told her what he saw. That night, after Ollie had gone to bed, Grace found herself staring out the living room window, gripping her phone tightly. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was ridiculous, that she was only feeding into something that needed to be let go. But her heart whispered a different story. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over Laura's name before she hesitated and instead typed in a new search: Hope Haven Shelter. It was a long shot, but Luke used to volunteer there on weekends, back when they were still piecing together their life. He had always said he wanted to help people who had nowhere else to go. If, by some impossible chance, he had survived, maybe, just maybe, that part of him had stayed the same. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before a tired, gravelly voice answered. Hope Haven, this is Mr. Harris. Grace cleared her throat. Hi, I don't know if you'll remember me. My name is Grace Thompson. There was a pause. Then Laura sighed. Oh, honey. He was so sure. Grace squeezed her eyes shut. And the worst part? For a second, I wanted to believe him. Kids have vivid imaginations, Laura said gently. He probably saw someone with a similar build. You remember how Sarah was convinced she saw her grandma at the grocery store 2 years after she passed? Grace nodded absently, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Laura continued, her voice soothing. It's normal, Grace. He misses his dad. But you know as well as I do, if Luke were alive, he would have come home. Grace swallowed against the lump in her throat. Yeah, you're right. After they hung up, she lingered in the kitchen, the unease in her chest refusing to fade. By the time she finally climbed into bed, her mind was still spinning. Sleep came in restless waves, dreams muddled with memories. The sound of Luke's laughter, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the warmth of his hand in hers. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the nagging question, what if? The next morning, Grace moved through the kitchen on autopilot, pouring herself a cup of coffee while Ollie sat at the table, absent-mindedly pushing his cereal around with his spoon. The morning sunlight poured through the window, casting long golden streaks across the countertop. But the usual warmth it brought felt muted today. Something about the air felt heavier, charged with the unspoken conversation from the night before. Mom? Ollie finally broke the silence, his voice hesitant. Grace tensed slightly but kept her eyes on the coffee swirling in her mug. Yeah, sweetheart? I know what I saw. His voice was quieter now, but steady, determined. Grace closed her eyes for a moment before turning to face him, leaning against the counter. Ollie, she started, but stopped herself. There was no easy way to make him let this go. Sometimes when we miss someone, we see them in places they aren't really there. But what if he was? Ollie pushed his bowl aside, sitting up straighter. What if Dad didn't... He swallowed. What if he didn't die? Grace set her mug down with a soft clink against the counter. Honey, we went through this. You remember what the police told us? What the report said? But there was never a body, Ollie pointed out quickly. That's what you always told me, that they never found him. Grace's breath caught. He had listened more closely than she realized. For years, she had told herself that Luke was gone. But in her darkest, most desperate moments, that same thought had haunted her. No body. No real proof. Just a car abandoned near a riverbank and 1,000 unanswered questions. She rubbed her temple. Ollie, I know how much you want this to be true, but wanting something doesn't make it real. His face fell, disappointment settling into his features. He pushed back his chair, grabbing his backpack from the floor. I gotta go, he mumbled, heading for the front door. Grace sighed, following him. Sweetheart, wait. But he was already out the door, hurrying down the steps toward his bike. She hesitated, watching as he pedaled down the street, his small frame rigid with frustration. A pang of guilt settled in her chest. She hated shutting him down like this, but what else could she do? As the day wore on, the unease gnawed at her. Between managing the cafe, filling out orders, and chatting with customers, her mind kept drifting back to the park, to the man on the bench, to the look in Ollie's eyes when he had told her what he saw. That night, after Ollie had gone to bed, Grace found herself staring out the living room window, gripping her phone tightly. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was ridiculous, that she was only feeding into something that needed to be let go. But her heart whispered a different story. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over Laura's name before she hesitated and instead typed in a new search. Hope Haven Shelter. It was a long shot, but Luke used to volunteer there on weekends, back when they were still piecing together their life. He had always said he wanted to help people who had nowhere else to go. If, by some impossible chance, he had survived, maybe, just maybe, that part of him had stayed the same. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before a tired, gravelly voice answered. Hope Haven, this is Mr. Harris. Grace cleared her throat. Hi, I don't know if you'll remember me. My name is Grace Thompson. There was a pause. Then, recognition. Grace? My goodness, it's been years. She let out a small breath. Yeah, it has. I know this is going to sound strange, but I need to ask you something. Another pause. Go on. Grace hesitated, gripping the phone tighter. Have you seen anyone recently? Anyone who looks like Luke? Silence stretched on the other end of the line. Then Mr. Harris sighed. Grace, I wasn't going to say anything, but since you called, her stomach dropped. I think I did see him. Last week. Grace's breath hitched. You think? I was locking up late one night, Mr. Harris continued, his voice cautious. Saw a man standing outside the shelter, tall, lean build. He had that same way of standing, like he was ready to run at any moment. But it was the eyes, Grace. The way he looked at me. It reminded me of Luke. Grace pressed a hand to her chest, her heart thudding. Why didn't you say anything? Because I wasn't sure, Mr. Harris admitted. And because if it was him, I had to wonder, why hasn't he come home? Grace swallowed hard. That question hung between them like a weight, pressing down on her. I don't know, she whispered. Mr. Harris sighed. If you want to find out, I'd check back at the park. If he was there once, maybe he'll return. Grace ended the call and sat in stunned silence, staring at the phone in her hands. A mix of emotions swirled inside her. Hope, fear, disbelief. Ollie had been right. The next night, after putting Ollie to bed, she made her way back to the park. The streetlights cast long shadows, making everything look unfamiliar and slightly eerie. She wrapped her arms around herself, stepping carefully along the paved path. The bench where Ollie had seen him was empty. She scanned the area, her heart hammering in her chest. Then from the corner of her eye she saw movement. A figure stood just beyond the playground, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees. Grace's breath caught as she turned. Luke? The figure hesitated. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, into the dim glow of the streetlight. Her knees nearly buckled. It was him. Older, thinner. His face was rougher, his beard unkempt, but his eyes were the same deep, piercing gaze that had once made her feel like the only person in the world. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then, in a hoarse, broken voice, he whispered, Grace. Tears welled in her eyes. You're alive. Luke swallowed hard. I never wanted to leave you. Anger and relief crashed inside her like a violent storm. Then why did you? His jaw tensed. It wasn't safe. Safe from what? She demanded, stepping closer. Luke, do you have any idea what you put us through? Pain flickered across his face. I had no choice. Explain it to me, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Because I don't understand. I don't understand how you could leave us, how you could leave him. Luke's gaze flickered downward. Ollie. His voice cracked. He saw me, didn't he? Grace let out a shaky breath. Yes. And he knew, Luke. He knew it was you. Luke ran a trembling hand through his messy hair. I didn't want him to see me like this. Then why were you here? A long silence. Then, in barely more than a whisper, he said, because I couldn't stay away anymore. Grace took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then come home. Luke hesitated. It's not that simple. Her stomach clenched. Then make it simple. He looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. I don't know if I can. Grace took a step closer, her voice fierce. Then you better try. Luke's hands curled into fists at his sides. If I come back, they'll find me. A chill ran through Grace. Who? Luke exhaled sharply. The people I owe my life to. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't over. And whatever Luke had been running from, it was coming straight for them. Grace felt the weight of his words press against her chest like a vice. The night air was cool, but she was suddenly burning, her pulse quickening. She searched Luke's face, trying to decipher the meaning behind what he had just said. The people I owe my life to. It sounded ominous, dangerous. Her hands clenched at her sides, 1,000 emotions fighting for dominance. Relief that he was alive, anger that he had stayed away, and fear that whatever had kept him hidden for 6 years wasn't finished with him yet. Luke took a step back, his gaze darting toward the empty street behind them. His movements were tense, guarded. He was afraid. That realization sent a fresh wave of dread washing over her. He wasn't just hesitant about returning. He was running from something. Luke, she whispered, stepping forward. Who are they? His jaw tightened. People I should have never been involved with. He exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. I thought I could handle it. I thought I had time. But when the debt got too high, they made it clear that if I didn't pay, you and Ollie would be the ones who suffered. Grace's stomach twisted. So you disappeared. I didn't have a choice. His voice was hoarse, raw. They were watching me. They knew where I worked, where we lived. The threats started coming more frequently. At first, they were just words. Then things escalated. The day before I left, I found a note on my car with a picture of you and Ollie walking home from school. His voice broke on the last word and he looked away, his hands shaking. I couldn't let them get to you. Grace's breath came in short, uneven bursts. The idea of someone following them, watching them, using them as leverage, it made her sick. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the timeline, to reconcile what she had believed all these years with what he was telling her now. They found your car, she said carefully, studying him. Near the river. Luke nodded. I left it there on purpose. I needed them to think I was dead. I got rid of everything that could trace back to me. My ID, my credit cards. I had cash saved up, just enough to disappear. I hitchhiked out of town and never looked back. The words made her dizzy. Her fingers twitched at her sides. She wanted to scream at him, shake him, demand to know why he had never let her know, never sent a single message to say he was alive. But she also knew the answer. He had truly believed he was protecting them. Why now? She asked, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. Why come back? Luke swallowed hard. Because it's over. She frowned. What do you mean, over? His eyes flickered with something unreadable. I paid the debt. She stared at him. How? I worked, he said simply. Cash jobs, construction, labor, whatever I could find. I lived on nothing, ate what I could. Every dime I made went to them. It took 6 years, but I finally paid what I owed. Grace's hands were trembling now. 6 years. 6 years of struggling, of grieving, of raising Ollie alone. And all this time, Luke had been out there, barely surviving just to make sure they stayed safe. The anger that had been simmering inside her flared into something sharper, more painful. "You should have told me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You should have let me know." "I couldn't," Luke said, and this time, there was something desperate in his voice. "If they even suspected I had contact with you, they would have used it against me." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to keep her emotions in check. It was too much. The years of pain, the sudden reappearance, the weight of his secrets. It was all suffocating. "I don't know how to process this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke took a step forward, hesitated, then took another. He was close now, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face, the new lines that hadn't been there before, the way his body seemed leaner, almost hollowed out from the years of struggle. "I don't expect you to," he said quietly. "I just need you to know that I never stopped thinking about you, about Ollie. Every day, every night. I missed you both more than I can ever put into words." Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. "He saw you," she murmured. "At the park." A flicker of pain crossed Luke's face. "I know." "He recognized you." Luke exhaled shakily. He was always smart. "He's not going to stop looking for you now," she said, her voice firmer. "He's convinced you're alive. I can't lie to him." "I don't want you to," Luke admitted. "That's why I'm here." Grace stared at him, her heart pounding. "Are you saying—" "I want to see him," Luke said, his voice cracking. "I want my son back." Tears blurred her vision. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, imagined impossible scenarios where Luke returned, where their family was whole again. But reality was messier, heavier, tangled in things that couldn't be undone. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "You can't just walk in and pretend nothing happened." "I know." His voice was barely audible. "But I have to try." Grace looked away, blinking rapidly. This wasn't just about her. This was about Ollie. About the little boy who had spent years wishing for his father to come back, who had clung to faded photographs and old stories because that was all he had left. She turned back to Luke, her jaw tightening. "Then come home." Luke's breath caught. "Grace." "I mean it," she said, her voice steady. "No more hiding. No more running. If you really want to be in Ollie's life, you have to do it the right way. You have to face everything you left behind." He hesitated, conflict warring in his eyes. Then, finally, he nodded. Grace exhaled, her entire body trembling. "Tomorrow," she said. "Come tomorrow morning. I need time to prepare him." Luke ran a hand over his face, as if trying to ground himself. "Okay." Grace took a step back. "You should go before I change my mind." Luke hesitated for a second longer before nodding. "I'll be there." She turned and walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't look back. When she got home, she found Ollie curled up on the couch, fast asleep with a book resting on his chest. She knelt beside him, brushing his curls from his forehead. His face was peaceful, innocent. She envied that. Tomorrow, everything would change. She just didn't know if it would be for better or worse. The morning sun painted long streaks of gold across the kitchen floor as Grace stood by the stove, absently stirring a pot of oatmeal. Her mind was miles away, tangled in the events of the previous night. She kept replaying Luke's words, the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of everything he had carried alone for 6 years. She had barely slept, and when she had, her dreams had been filled with disjointed memories. Luke's laughter, Ollie's first steps, the night she had last seen her husband before he disappeared. The past and present felt like they were colliding in slow motion, and she wasn't sure how to brace for the impact. Behind her, the sound of soft footsteps broke the silence. She turned to see Ollie rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his hair a wild mess of curls. He yawned as he plopped down at the kitchen table, resting his chin in his palm. "You're up early," Grace said, trying to sound normal. Ollie blinked at her, still groggy. "Couldn't sleep." Grace hesitated, her grip tightening on the spoon. She wanted to tell him. She needed to tell him. But how? How did you prepare an 11-year-old for something like this? Ollie poked at the table absent-mindedly. "Mom?" She swallowed. "Yeah, sweetheart? Do you think Dad would be proud of me?" Her breath hitched. The question came out of nowhere and it made her heart ache. "Of course he would," she said softly. "He would be so proud of you, Ollie." Ollie nodded, but he didn't look convinced. "Sometimes I feel like I don't remember him as well as I should." His voice was small, uncertain. "Like he's starting to fade." Grace set the spoon down and walked over, crouching beside him. She reached out, tucking a stray curl behind his ear. "That's not your fault. You were so little when he—" She stopped herself. "When he left." Ollie looked at her then, his brown eyes searching hers. "I wasn't wrong, was I?" Grace's heart pounded. "Wrong about what?" His fingers curled around the edge of the table. "About the man in the park. It was him, wasn't it?" She didn't answer right away. She had spent all night trying to figure out the best way to break the news to him, but in the end, Ollie had already put the pieces together himself. He had always been too smart for his own good. Slowly, she exhaled. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ollie's whole body went still. His eyes widened, his mouth parting slightly. "It's really him?" Grace nodded, watching as a storm of emotions flickered across his face. Shock, confusion, hope, disbelief. "He's coming here today." Ollie shot up from his chair. "When? What time?" "Around 10, she said, checking the clock. It was already past 9. She had less than an hour to prepare herself for whatever was about to happen. Ollie's hands clenched into fists. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Grace sighed, reaching for him, but he pulled back. "I needed to be sure he was ready. That you were ready." Ollie shook his head. "I was ready. I've been ready for 6 years." She swallowed back the lump in her throat. "I know, sweetheart." Ollie took a deep breath, exhaling shakily. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say to him." Grace gave him a sad smile. "Just say whatever's in your heart." The next hour passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Grace kept pacing, checking the clock every few minutes, while Ollie sat stiffly on the couch, staring at the front door like it might open on its own. The weight of waiting was suffocating. Then, at exactly 10 o'clock, there was a knock. Ollie bolted upright. Grace's stomach twisted painfully as she made her way to the door, pausing for half a second before opening it, and there he was. Luke stood on the porch, hands stuffed into the pockets of an old jacket, his shoulders slightly hunched. He looked the same and yet so different. His features were sharper, his posture more guarded. But his eyes, the same deep-set, warm brown eyes that Ollie had inherited, were filled with something fragile, something unspoken. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Luke's gaze shifted past Grace and landed on Ollie. His breath visibly caught in his throat. Ollie took a step forward, his face unreadable. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but firm. "You're real." Luke let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped inside him for years. He nodded. "Yeah, buddy, I'm real." Ollie's face twisted, his emotions warring. His hands trembled at his sides, and then, in one sudden movement, he rushed forward, throwing his arms around his father's waist. Luke froze for a second, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Then he wrapped his arms around Ollie, holding on to him like he might disappear if he let go. "I knew it," Ollie mumbled into his father's shirt, his voice shaking. "I knew you were out there." Luke squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his face into his son's curls. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here." Grace turned away, blinking back tears. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, but seeing them together after all these years was too much. When Ollie finally pulled back, he wiped at his eyes, sniffing. "Are you staying?" Luke hesitated, looking at Grace. She held his gaze, then gave the smallest nod. "If you'll have me," Luke said softly, looking back at his son. Ollie grinned, his face still streaked with tears. "You have to stay. We have so much to catch up on." Luke smiled, his first real smile in years. "Yeah, we do." The next few hours were filled with cautious conversations, stories exchanged over coffee and sandwiches, and Ollie bombarding Luke with questions: where he had been, what he had done, why he had never sent a message. Luke answered as honestly as he could, though some answers were harder to hear than others. When night fell, Ollie refused to let Luke out of his sight, dragging him to the living room to watch a movie together. Grace sat on the other side of the couch, watching them in quiet disbelief. It still didn't feel real. But as she listened to the sound of her son's laughter, saw the way Luke's shoulders slowly relaxed like he was allowing himself to breathe again, she realized something. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal. It wouldn't be easy. There were still wounds that needed time to close, still shadows from the past lurking in the corners. But for the first time in 6 years, Grace allowed herself to believe that they could be a family again. And that was enough. William smiled slightly at his son's excitement as he turned the heavy lock on the cabin's door. "Something like that, buddy," he said, his voice low but steady. "Let me check inside first." He disappeared into the dark interior, the beam of his flashlight sweeping methodically across the small space. Outside, Emma instinctively pulled Liam closer, her fingers brushing through his curls in a comforting gesture. "Think of it as a special camping trip," she murmured, trying to keep her tone light even as her heart pounded. "Sometimes the best adventures happen when we least expect them." Liam frowned, tilting his head up to meet her gaze. "But why are we camping on a school night?" He sounded puzzled, not afraid, which was a relief. Emma forced a small smile, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "Sometimes families need surprise adventures," she replied gently. "It makes life more interesting, don't you think?" Liam didn't look entirely convinced, but before he could ask more questions, William reappeared in the doorway and nodded. "All clear. Come inside." The inside of the cabin was sparse but functional. A few blankets were piled in the corner, a couple of rickety chairs stood near a dusty wooden table, and shelves lined the walls with basic supplies: canned food, bottles of water, an old lantern, and some candles. It wasn't home, but it would do for now. William worked quickly, laying out thick blankets on the floor and stacking pillows from their bags to create a makeshift sleeping area. "I know it's not much," he admitted, adjusting one of the blankets. "But it's safe. No one knows about this place." Emma nodded, offering a small but sincere smile. "It's perfect for now." William returned her smile and squeezed her shoulder gently before straightening. "I'm going to check the perimeter, make sure we weren't followed. Lock the door behind me." Emma obeyed without hesitation, bolting the door securely. Then she turned back to Liam, helping him settle into his makeshift bed. His earlier excitement had faded, replaced by heavy eyelids and slow blinks as she tucked the blanket around him. By the time William returned, Emma was still sitting beside their son, watching the slow, peaceful rise and fall of his chest as he slept. Moonlight streamed through the single window, casting a soft glow over them. William sat beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We're safe here," he whispered, his eyes never leaving Liam's sleeping face. "No one followed us. We can rest tonight." Emma leaned into his embrace, some of the tension in her body easing. For the first time since they had fled their home, she took a deep, steady breath and allowed herself to believe they had a moment of peace. A sharp rustling of leaves outside jolted her awake. Morning sunlight barely filtered through the trees as Emma's eyes flew open, her body going rigid. William was already on his feet, standing by the window with his shoulders taut and his gaze locked on something outside. "Someone's out there," he whispered, motioning for her to stay quiet. Emma barely breathed as she instinctively reached for Liam, but he was still asleep, undisturbed by the tension thick in the air. Through the gap in the curtains, a lone figure emerged from the trees. He was older, his silver-streaked hair unkempt, his clothes worn from years of use. He moved with a cautious but determined stride, his eyes scanning the cabin as if searching for something. Then suddenly, William's entire stance changed. His shoulders relaxed and his grip on the curtain eased. "Samuel," he exhaled, his voice barely above a breath. Before Emma could react, William unbolted the door and stepped outside. The older man entered without hesitation, his face lined with worry. "Thank God I found you in time," Samuel said, his voice rough but familiar. "The collectors? They're closer than you think." Emma stayed protectively near Liam, her posture rigid as she took in the stranger. She didn't relax until William placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Emma, this is Samuel. He helped me escape when things first went bad. Without him, I wouldn't have survived the first year." Samuel gave her a nod, his expression serious. "I've been keeping an eye on them. They've got people watching your house, and now they're expanding their search. It won't be long before they start looking in these woods." William dragged a hand through his hair. "How did you know where to find us?" Samuel offered a small smile. "This was always your backup plan, wasn't it? When I heard they were moving in closer, I figured you'd come here. But it's not safe anymore." He hesitated before continuing, his gaze shifting between them. "We need to move further into the woods, or we find a way to end this." Emma stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Can we trust him?" William met her eyes and nodded. "Samuel risked everything for me before. He knows how they work, how they think. Without him, I never would have made it." Liam stirred, his brow furrowing as he slowly sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Dad? What's happening?" William knelt beside him, his tone gentle. "This is Mr. Samuel, an old friend. He's here to help us." Samuel's gaze softened slightly as he looked at Liam, then back at William. "We don't have much time. There's a place deeper in the forest where you'd be safer. Or we could fight back. But that's a dangerous road to take." Emma turned to William, her jaw tightening with determination. "We've been running for too long," she said. William looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. He knew they were at a turning point. The late afternoon sun filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as Emma, William, and Samuel sat around a makeshift table made of old crates. Outside, Liam played with a small wooden boat William had carved for him that morning, his soft laughter floating through the air. "Here's what we know," Samuel began, spreading out a rough map he had drawn. "The collectors always work in pairs and they stick to their habits. They'll want to meet somewhere they feel like they have the upper hand." William nodded, his fingers drumming against the table. "We need to pick the meeting spot carefully. Somewhere public enough that they won't try anything reckless, but private enough that we can record them without interference." "The old train station," Emma suggested, her voice calm despite the tension in her chest. "It's always deserted after dark, but it's still well lit and close to the main road." Samuel's eyes brightened slightly. "That could work. I have some recording equipment I can set up in advance. If we can get them to admit their threats on tape, we'll have leverage." "I'll be the one to call them," William said, reaching for Emma's hand beneath the table. "I'll tell them I'm done running, that I want to settle things. They're arrogant enough to believe it?" Emma squeezed his fingers. "I can watch from the old ticket booth. If I see them arriving early or bringing backup, I'll warn you." Samuel pulled 2 small devices from his pocket. "These are old but reliable. 2-way radios. We'll each take one." As they planned, Emma kept glancing at Liam through the window. He was completely engrossed in his game, blissfully unaware of the weight of the decisions being made inside. "Once we have the recording," Samuel continued, "we go straight to the police. These aren't just loan sharks. They're criminals. This evidence will be enough to take them down. William let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. We need to move fast. The second they realize what's happening, they'll disappear. Emma nodded, already running through worst-case scenarios in her head. But when she looked at William, saw the spark of hope flicker in his eyes for the first time in days, she knew this was their best chance. As Liam gathered up his toy and headed inside for dinner, Emma made a silent promise to herself. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would keep her son safe, no matter what it took. The night settled over the forest like a thick, impenetrable curtain. Outside the cabin, the only sounds were the occasional rustling of branches swayed by the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. Inside, the dim glow of a lantern flickered against the wooden walls, casting long shadows over William, Emma, and Samuel as they went over the plan one final time. Liam had already fallen asleep, curled up in a pile of blankets near the fireplace, his breathing deep and steady. William leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together as he stared at the makeshift map Samuel had drawn on an old sheet of parchment. His jaw was tense, his eyes dark with thought. "We'll meet them here, at the train station," he murmured, tracing his finger over the sketch of the abandoned depot. "It's far enough from town that we won't draw attention, but close enough that if anything goes wrong, we can get away quickly." Samuel adjusted his glasses and nodded. "And you'll be wired with the recorder," he reminded William. "I'll be close by, out of sight, but within earshot. Emma will be stationed in the ticket booth, keeping watch. If she sees anything suspicious, she'll signal us." Emma exhaled slowly, gripping her two-way radio. "And if something does go wrong?" Samuel hesitated for only a second before replying. "Then we abort. No unnecessary risks. The goal is to get a confession, not to confront them head-on. If we get what we need, we go straight to the authorities." William tightened his grip on the edge of the table. "And if they don't fall for it?" Samuel met his gaze with a knowing look. "Then we figure out a new plan. But let's hope it doesn't come to that." The next day, the weight of the plan settled heavily over them. They spent most of the morning in quiet preparation, going over the details again and again. Samuel checked the recording equipment multiple times, ensuring everything was operational. Emma packed a small bag with essentials, extra batteries for the radio, a flashlight, and a first aid kit just in case. Liam, sensing the tension in the air, kept his distance, watching his parents with wide, questioning eyes, but not saying much. When evening arrived, William crouched down in front of Liam and ruffled his hair gently. "I need you to be brave tonight, buddy," he said softly. "Stay here in the cabin, no matter what. Samuel's friend will be here to keep an eye on you." Liam frowned, his fingers twisting in the fabric of his sweater. "But what if you don't come back?" Emma knelt beside them, taking Liam's small hands in hers. "We will come back," she promised, her voice unwavering. "You just have to trust us." Liam bit his lip, then nodded. "Okay." The drive to the train station was silent. William gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. Emma sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, watching as the trees blurred past in the fading light. In the back seat, Samuel double-checked the recording device, adjusting the microphone hidden beneath William's collar. As they neared the station, the old building loomed ahead, its rusted metal beams illuminated by the glow of a distant street lamp. The place had once been a bustling transportation hub, but now it stood abandoned, forgotten. It was the perfect location, secluded, but not so isolated that the collectors would suspect a trap. William pulled into the lot, killed the engine, and took a deep breath. This is it. Emma squeezed his hand once before slipping out of the car and making her way to the ticket booth. The small structure was dark and dusty, but it provided a clear vantage point of the platform where the meeting would take place. She set up her radio, testing it with a quiet click. "I'm in position," she whispered. Samuel and William stepped onto the platform, the boards creaking beneath their feet. William pulled his coat tighter around himself as he scanned the empty tracks. They were early. Now all they could do was wait. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, finally, headlights pierced through the darkness. A sleek black sedan rolled into view, its tires crunching against the gravel. Two men stepped out, their movements slow and deliberate. William recognized them instantly. The taller of the two was Vincent, a man he had once trusted back when the whole ordeal had started. The other, a stocky figure with a scar running down the side of his face, was unfamiliar. Vincent's lips curled into a smirk as he approached. "William Thompson?" he drawled, his tone laced with mock amusement. "Look at you. I half expected you to still be hiding under a rock." William forced himself to remain calm. "I'm tired of running," he said evenly. "You win. Let's talk." Vincent's smirk deepened. "That's more like it." From her hiding spot, Emma gripped the edge of the window frame, watching intently as the conversation unfolded. She couldn't hear every word, but she could see William's posture, stiff but confident. Samuel remained just outside the shadows, his hand hovering near his concealed weapon, just in case. "We had a deal," William continued. "I want to settle this, but I need to know my family is safe." Vincent chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't make demands, Thompson. That's not how this works. You think just because you show up and say the right words, everything gets wiped clean?" William's jaw tightened. "I'm willing to pay, but I want assurances." The scarred man scoffed. "Assurances? You lost that privilege when you ran. You owe us more than just money now." Vincent's eyes darkened. "We know where your wife and kid are. We know where they sleep. If you think—" Samuel made a small, barely perceptible gesture. It was enough. The recorder had everything. Emma's heart pounded as she raised the radio to her lips. Now, before William could react, Samuel moved. In one swift motion, he yanked the small device from William's jacket pocket, pressing a button to stop the recording. Vincent's eyes flickered with suspicion. "What the hell is that?" Samuel remained composed. "Just a guarantee that you were going to play fair." Vincent took a step forward, his expression shifting into something more dangerous. "You son of a—" The sudden blare of approaching sirens cut through the tension like a knife. The collectors stiffened, their heads snapping toward the distant flashing lights. Samuel smirked. "Looks like the game is over." Vincent snarled, spinning on his heel. "Move!" he barked at his partner, both of them scrambling back toward the car. Emma bolted from the ticket booth just as two squad cars screeched into the lot. Officers spilled out, guns drawn, voices shouting. The collectors barely made it a few feet before they were surrounded. William exhaled sharply, his entire body shaking with adrenaline. Emma reached him just as he stumbled slightly, catching his arm. "It's over," she whispered. He turned to look at her, his eyes searching hers as if trying to confirm that this was real, that they had actually won. The officers secured the collectors in handcuffs, reading them their rights. One of the detectives turned to William and Samuel. "We've been after these guys for a long time," he said. "Thanks to your recording, we've got everything we need to put them away." William could barely process the words. It didn't feel real. After 6 years of running, hiding, fearing every shadow, was it truly over? Samuel clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, kid." Emma squeezed his hand. "We did it." As they stood there, the weight of it all finally beginning to lift, William realized something. For the first time in years, he could breathe. Of course, here's the continuation, maintaining the length, names, and storyline while ensuring everything is fully rewritten, expanded, and transformed into unique text. The sound of the restaurant's front door chime echoed through the warm air as Emma wiped down the last of the tables, the scent of freshly baked bread still lingering from the dinner rush. Second chances. Bistro had been open for only a few months, but already it had become a beloved gathering place for locals. Families came in for weekend breakfasts, couples for cozy dinners, and friends gathered for late-night coffee and laughter. The hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware, and the occasional bursts of laughter had become a comforting symphony, a stark contrast to the fear and silence that had once filled their lives. William emerged from the kitchen, stretching his arms above his head. The day had been long, but satisfying. He wiped his hands on a towel and surveyed the restaurant, pride swelling in his chest. The wooden tables gleamed under the dim glow of the hanging lights, and the framed photos along the wall told the story of their journey, from the day they reopened the doors to candid shots of Liam grinning behind the counter, trying his hand at taking orders. Liam sat at a booth near the window, scribbling furiously in his notebook. He had taken to documenting the restaurant's progress, filling pages with sketches of future menu ideas, social media strategies, and plans for special events. Every now and then, he'd look up, scanning the room as if envisioning what the place would look like years down the road. Emma leaned against the counter, watching both of them with a soft smile. "I think tonight was our busiest yet," she murmured, running a hand through her hair. William nodded, rolling his shoulders. "It's a good problem to have." Liam suddenly perked up. "We should do something big," he said, tapping his pencil against his notebook. "Like a community night. Free samples, live music, maybe even a cooking demo from Dad." Emma chuckled. "You're always thinking, aren't you?" Liam grinned. "Of course, we have to keep the momentum going." William glanced at Emma, raising an eyebrow. "What do you think? Should we give the kid creative control?" Emma smirked. "As long as he doesn't try to turn this place into a video game cafe." Liam huffed. "One suggestion and you never let it go." The comfortable banter continued as they closed up for the night. William locked the front doors, double-checking them as he always did. The habit of being cautious hadn't faded entirely, though the fear that once accompanied it had lessened. As he turned back, he caught Emma watching him. "You okay?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just adjusting. It still feels strange, not having to look over my shoulder." Emma stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. "We're here. We're safe. And we built this together." William exhaled slowly, nodding. He glanced toward Liam, who was still deep in his notebook, already planning their next big event. "Yeah," William murmured, letting a small smile tug at the corner of his lips. "We did." The next morning, the scent of fresh coffee filled the air as Emma stood behind the counter, preparing for the morning rush. The bell above the door jingled as Samuel stepped inside, shaking the morning chill from his coat. "Morning, early birds," he greeted, setting a newspaper on the counter. "Looks like the world's still turning." Emma poured him a cup of coffee, sliding it across the counter. "You're in a good mood." Samuel smirked. "Well, let's just say I'm enjoying seeing you folks thrive." He tapped the newspaper. "And it looks like the rest of the town is, too." William wiped his hands on a dish towel as he approached, raising an eyebrow. "What's that?" Samuel unfolded the paper, turning it so they could see the front page. An article about Second Chance's Bistro took up nearly half the page, complete with a photo of William in the kitchen and Emma smiling behind the counter. "Local family rebuilds life through food," the headline read. Emma blinked in surprise. "I didn't even know they were writing about us." "Guess word's getting around," Samuel said, taking a sip of coffee. "People like a good comeback story." Liam, who had been standing nearby, pumped his fist in the air. "See, I told you we're becoming famous." William chuckled, shaking his head. "Let's just focus on making good food." But as he glanced at the paper again, a warmth spread through his chest. This place wasn't just a restaurant. It was proof that they had survived, that they had fought for their future and won. That evening, as the last customers trickled out and the restaurant quieted, Emma walked onto the back patio where William was stacking chairs. The stars were bright overhead, casting a soft glow over the small space. She wrapped her arms around herself, breathing in the crisp night air. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had never come back?" William paused, then set the last chair in place. "Yeah," he admitted. "I think about it a lot." Emma turned toward him. "And?" He met her gaze, his expression serious but calm. "I think No matter what, we would have found our way back to each other. A lump formed in Emma's throat. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him. He held her tightly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We're not running anymore," he murmured. Emma nodded against his chest. "We're not." The weeks passed, each one better than the last. The restaurant continued to thrive, and with every meal served, every satisfied customer, the scars of their past felt a little less raw. Samuel became a regular fixture, offering advice and sharing stories from his own years in the industry. Liam took over their online presence, managing their social media accounts with the enthusiasm of a true entrepreneur. One day, as William was preparing the day's special, Liam burst into the kitchen, waving his phone excitedly. "Dad, we're trending." William blinked. "We're what?" Liam shoved the screen in his face. A video he had posted, a simple behind-the-scenes clip of William cooking, had gone viral overnight. Comments flooded in, people asking about the restaurant, about their story. Emma peeked over William's shoulder, eyebrows raised. "Well, I guess we really are famous now." William sighed, rubbing his temple. "I just hope this doesn't mean I have to start doing cooking tutorials." Liam grinned. "Oh, it definitely does." As they laughed, as the restaurant filled once again with life and warmth, William realized something. For years he had been haunted by the past, weighed down by the fear that he would never be free. But now, standing in the middle of the life they had rebuilt, he knew the truth. The past was just that, the past. And the future? The future was theirs. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of running Second Chance's Bistro became second nature to William, Emma, and Liam. The restaurant had not only become their livelihood, but a symbol of their survival, a place where the weight of their past no longer had control over them. Business was steady, and the community had embraced their story. Samuel had practically become an honorary staff member, offering wisdom from years of experience in the food industry, while subtly keeping an eye on William, as if ensuring he didn't overwork himself. One afternoon, Emma glanced up from the register to see a familiar face standing in the doorway. For a moment, she couldn't place him, but then realization struck. Officer Martinez, the detective who had helped them put Vincent and his associates behind bars. Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to keep calm. The past wasn't supposed to haunt them anymore. William, wiping his hands on his apron, noticed the shift in Emma's posture and turned toward the entrance. When he saw who it was, his expression remained steady, but a flicker of unease passed through his eyes. "Detective?" William greeted, setting down a plate of fresh pastries. "Didn't expect to see you here." Martinez stepped forward with a small nod. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check in." He glanced around the restaurant, a hint of approval in his gaze. "Looks like things are going well for you." Emma exhaled, setting a coffee cup in front of him. "We've been lucky," she said carefully. Martinez accepted the cup but didn't immediately drink. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice. "That's why I'm here. I wanted to give you a heads up. Vincent's case is coming up for sentencing next month." William stiffened. He had tried to push that part of their story to the back of his mind, to focus on moving forward, but hearing Vincent's name dragged it all back like an anchor sinking into his chest. Emma's fingers curled around the edge of the counter. "And?" Martinez sighed. "His legal team has been pushing for a lighter sentence. His lawyers are arguing that his crimes were financial in nature, that he never followed through on the threats, and that technically no physical harm was ever inflicted." Emma's breath caught. "You mean he could get out early?" Martinez nodded grimly. "It's a possibility. Not a certainty, but something you should be prepared for." William felt his stomach churn. The idea of Vincent walking free, possibly holding a grudge, made his blood run cold. He had spent so long protecting his family from that man, and now the threat, however distant, was creeping back in. Liam's voice suddenly cut through the tension. "If that guy gets out, what does that mean for us?" Emma turned sharply, realizing too late that Liam had been standing just a few feet away, having overheard the conversation. His arms were crossed, his face tight with concern. Martinez looked at William, waiting for his response. William swallowed, then crouched down to his son's level. "It means we stay alert," he said carefully. "But we don't let fear control our lives anymore. We're stronger now." Liam searched his father's face before nodding. "Good. Because I'm not running again." Pride swelled in William's chest, but so did an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He needed to make sure his son never had to be afraid again. Martinez finished his coffee and stood. "I'll keep you updated," he said. "I don't think you need to worry just yet, but I wanted you to hear it from me first." Emma forced a small smile. "Thanks for looking out for us." After Martinez left, the unease lingered. That night, after Liam had gone to bed, William and Emma sat on the back porch, the cool night air doing little to calm their nerves. "We should have a plan," Emma murmured, tracing invisible patterns on the railing. William exhaled. "We already have one. We built a life here. We made connections. If Vincent ever comes near us again, we won't be alone this time." Emma nodded, but still looked troubled. I don't want to live in fear again." William reached for her hand. "We won't." As much as he wanted to believe that, he knew one thing for certain. If Vincent ever came knocking, William wouldn't hesitate to protect his family. A new challenge. A month passed and life at Second Chance's Bistro continued with a steady rhythm. The sentencing hearing had come and gone, and news eventually reached them that Vincent had received a longer sentence than expected. It was a relief, but William knew better than to be complacent. Liam had thrown himself into the restaurant's success, coming up with a new idea every week. One afternoon, he practically burst into the kitchen, waving his phone. "Dad, I just got an email from a big foodie blogger," Liam exclaimed. "She wants to visit and review our place." William raised an eyebrow. "A blogger?" Liam nodded excitedly. "Not just any blogger, Sophie Carter. She has like 1 million followers. If she likes us, we could get customers from all over." Emma walked in, drying her hands. "That sounds amazing." William, however, felt a twinge of hesitation. He had never sought fame or recognition. All he wanted was a stable life for his family. "You okay?" Emma asked, reading his expression. William sighed. "I just don't want this to turn into something bigger than we can handle." Liam crossed his arms. "Dad, we handle way more than most people. We got this." After some convincing, William agreed. When the day of the visit arrived, the restaurant buzzed with anticipation. Liam had set up a small area for food photography. Emma had arranged fresh flowers for the tables, and William was in the kitchen, perfecting every dish. Sophie Carter arrived right on time, her presence impossible to miss. She was confident, stylish, and carried a camera almost as naturally as a chef carried a knife. She ordered a variety of dishes, taking notes as she ate. William and Emma watched from a distance, nerves prickling at the silence. Finally, Sophie set down her fork and grinned. "This is phenomenal." Liam practically vibrated with excitement. "You think so?" Sophie nodded. "Not only is the food incredible, but this place has heart." Emma exhaled in relief, while William let himself smile. By the end of the night, Sophie had posted about Second Chance's Bistro, and within hours their reservations doubled. As the family sat together after closing, exhausted but happy, William looked at his wife and son and realized something. They had fought so hard to reclaim their lives. They had built something real, something lasting. They had won. And no matter what came next, they would face it, together. The days following Sophie Carter's visit to Second Chance's Bistro were a whirlwind. Orders doubled, then tripled. Locals who had dined with them for months now found themselves waiting for tables, and visitors from neighboring towns began making special trips just to try William's signature dishes. The restaurant that had once been a quiet refuge had suddenly become the talk of the town, and beyond. William spent longer hours in the kitchen, perfecting recipes, training new staff, and ensuring that the quality never slipped despite the sudden demand. Emma handled front of house with even more grace than usual, expertly managing reservations, customer inquiries, and hiring new team members to keep up with the growing clientele. Liam, ever the entrepreneur, worked tirelessly on the restaurant's social media, creating engaging content that kept the buzz alive. One evening, just as the last customers were leaving, Samuel sat at the counter nursing a cup of coffee, watching the family move seamlessly through their new normal. He smirked as William wiped his hands on his apron and collapsed into the stool beside him. "You're a big deal now, kid," Samuel mused, sipping his coffee. William let out a tired chuckle. "Not sure how that happened." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Hard work, talent, a bit of stubbornness. Take your pick." Emma walked over, rubbing her temples. "We just had to turn down 3 more last-minute reservations. We're completely booked through the weekend." Liam grinned, setting his phone on the counter. "And we just hit 10,000 followers on our restaurant's Instagram." William blinked. 10,000? "Yep," Liam said, scrolling through the comments. "People are obsessed with your cooking, Dad." William sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just wanted a simple restaurant, not all this attention." Samuel chuckled. "That's how it always starts. But success has a way of creeping up on you." Emma frowned, sensing the unease in her husband's voice. "You're worried." William exhaled. "I don't want this to turn into something we can't handle. I don't want to lose why we started this in the first place." Emma placed a hand on his. "Then we make sure we don't. We set boundaries. We grow at our own pace." Liam nodded eagerly. "And if it gets too crazy, we can always franchise." William groaned. "Not helping, kid." The next morning, a sleek black car pulled up outside the restaurant just as they were setting up for breakfast service. A sharply dressed man stepped out, adjusting his watch as he approached the entrance. Emma and William exchanged glances before she moved to greet him. "Good morning. Welcome to Second Chance's Bistro. How can we help you?" The man smiled, pulling out a business card. "My name is Jonathan Pierce. I represent a restaurant investment group based in Chicago. We've been following your story, and I must say we're very impressed." Emma accepted the card cautiously. "Thank you," Jonathan continued, his tone smooth and practiced. "We believe your restaurant has incredible potential beyond this town. With the right backing, you could expand. Multiple locations, a brand, maybe even a cookbook." William, who had been listening from a few feet away, folded his arms. "We're happy where we are." Jonathan's smile didn't falter. "Of course. But wouldn't you like to take what you've built and bring it to a larger audience? Imagine Second Chance's Bistro in cities across the country." Emma hesitated. "That's a lot to consider." Jonathan slid a neatly bound proposal across the counter. "Take your time. My contact information is there. If you're interested, let's have a conversation." After he left, Emma and William sat in their usual corner booth, flipping through the proposal. The numbers were impressive, the possibilities endless. But something about it felt overwhelming.